Judge not, so you not be judged, for the measure you meet will be met unto you. In this episode, we're going to talk about self evident truths and how some words can have a religious meaning while at the same time have a secular meaning. For example, the word truths in the Declaration of Independence, in the first paragraph, it's talking about these truths that man are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Now, the word endowed, depending on how a word is used, may determine whether it's being used as a secular word, in a secular manner, or in a religious context. So obviously the context in this paragraph is religious, endowed by a creator. On the other hand, in the second paragraph, it talks about these same inalienable rights, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So now it's using the same word, inalienable rights, but in a secular manner, not in a religious manner. And so often some words may have a secular and also a religious significance. For example, the word secular itself means worldly. So it's a term that's used in the Bible, to be worldly. Many scriptures speak about the secular world in a religious way and how we are to conduct ourselves in the world if you are a religious person. On the other hand, there are statutes and ordinances in the laws of the Old Testament that were meant to be secular because they don't specifically refer to any religious practices. And so secular words and religious words really depend in part on how they're used. The same applies to the third paragraph. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed. The key here is the word dictate. Prudence dictates implies the same as the word creator is in the first paragraph. The creator endows, prudence dictates. And so we're speaking here in terms of divine law or natural law and how these operate and how their basic rules are defined independently of human laws or conditions. On the other hand, the same concept of prudence in the same paragraph is used also in a secular manner when it talks about the human condition and speaks of prudence in terms of mankind. Now it's talking about some aspect of human nature and how humans are disposed. So that's where I get the reference to nature. Human nature would be a secular reference, given that it's talking about government and evils created by governments that do not act in accordance with natural laws. So that would be a secular concern. And so the point of the Declaration of Independence is to use the secular ideas as a way to understand government and how governments are formed and how they are established and then can be of service and how they may serve those laws that are instituted by men, how they may serve those conditions that secure these rights, these inalienable rights that are endowed by the Creator. Now, today, the word secularism has different connotations, certain meanings. The way the word is used today is not dependent on how words are used. This is quite different than how it was in ancient world and with ancient languages, such as the Hebrew and Greek languages. Often words would have one meaning and yet could have a completely different meaning depending on how it was used or the context for how the word was applied. For example, the Ten Commandments, we see that God originally gave the Ten Commandments orally. Then he wrote them on these tablets. And then he had Moses write them down. So in each instance, the Ten Commandments have a different significance. In the first instance, it had nothing to do with government. It had to do more with relationship and the people having heard these words from God, or clearly it was a religious mandate, a sovereign declaration, if you prefer to call it that. On the other hand, when they were written down by God's hands, they became a form of government insofar as Moses would convey these laws, but he was also appointed by the people's consent. So the people wanted some form of government or human authority to rule over them, but this was by their own choice. And so we see the beginning of institutional laws and how they were first formed in ancient Israel. And that's the important part of this story of the Judaic Mosaic traditions, was how these laws first were given and then how they were institutionalized and made into a form of government. And so the government began with Moses, and then when Moses, in effect, passed judgment and enforced these laws, then a legal system was created, some means to enforce the laws that now the people had accepted over them. And so at this point, it wasn't God's actions. These were not sovereign acts. These were strictly the actions of Moses and the will of the people in accordance with the will of the people and their agreement to be ruled and to be judged in according to the commandments and the laws as they were given to Moses and as Moses had written them down. So that's why, in the third instance, God simply gave Moses the laws to write them down, because now it was given to him by the people to carry out these laws and to see that they were followed. And so it's a gradual progression. You see where at the beginning there was a religious significance that was implied by the laws and how they were given. But in the latter instance, we see that it was secular law then became a secular law or form of became secular, considering the government that consequently was created. And so once the laws became institutionalized, then they were also other judges would be appointed to carry them out, to carry out the judgments. And so Moses was the judge of how these laws were to be followed and kept. And then the other judges were appointed to carry out the details of how these laws would be applied and enforced to all. Now, religion itself, the word religion, means to bind, to draw back upon. And so to be religious is to form a contract or a relationship where you agree with is to make a bond or a relationship, is to act on a bond, is to act from a relationship. For example, the word duty implies this a kind of religious to act on duty or to act on principle or to be endowed is to have a moral obligation, and from moral obligation comes religious action or beliefs, not the other way around. If you don't have a moral compass, then your beliefs are of, of no effect. On the other hand, secular ideas have to do with judgments, how laws are enforced, how they're kept, and general practices of how they are enforced. And so once you have government, then you have determined how these things are to be communicated and how then they are to be judged. And so Many people that read the Bible assume that it's simply God's judgments is what we see when when He gave the law. That what followed the children of Israel and their journey was simply God's judgments based on their disobedience to the law. But actually, it was their own law that they had institutionalized and then was codified so that then these laws would be it was then decided how they would be practiced and how they would be kept.